Okay, gotta admit, even if you're not like a huge history buff, you know the name Red Baron? It sounds kind of cool. Like right away you picture, well, I picture at least, this like fearless pilot, you know, up in the sky, World War One. But was he really all that? Like, is Manfred von Richthofen, that's his real name, was he really that amazing?
It's a question that's been asked a lot, and for good reason, I think.
And to figure that out, well, we've got some sources for this deep dive. We're looking at a National Geographic article. It's in Spanish, and then also his English Wikipedia page. Manfred von Richthofen.
Should be interesting to compare those.
Yeah. Now we'll keep the language pretty simple, you know?
Yeah.
So that even if you're not like a World War I expert, you can follow along, no problem.
Sounds good.
My question starting out is he just a name? Or was there something really special about this guy?
Well, what makes him even more interesting is how his story, like, really connects to how war itself was changing during World War I.
Yeah, that's a good point. So, okay, we know he was a pilot in World War I.
Yeah.
But, like, what else? What was his, like, early life? What kind of world did he come from?
So he was born in 1892, right? Into
Yeah.
this Prussian aristocratic family, like serious military tradition.
Ah.
So horseback riding, hunting, the whole deal. He even won awards, believe it or not, in gymnastics.
Gymnastics, yeah. Not exactly what you think of when you picture, like, you know, a fighter pilot.
Right. You'd think he'd be like obsessed with planes from day one or something.
Yeah. But I guess, I mean, you said military family, so.
Exactly. So he follows that tradition, right? Joins the Ulan cavalry.
The cavalry, huh?
But then here's where World War I, like, really changes things. Imagine this. You train your whole life for these, like, cavalry charges, right? And you end up stuck in, brutal trench warfare.
Oh, yeah. Not a lot of use for cavalry charges in the trenches.
No, it was basically obsolete. So Richthofen ends up doing these, like, mundane tasks, delivering messages. The National Geographic article, it actually uses the words, let me see, inhumane and boring to describe the trenches.
Oh, wow. Yeah, you can see why he'd be pretty disillusioned with that, huh?
Absolutely. Especially for someone, who's eager to prove himself.
So how does he go from cavalry to the air service then? Like, how does that happen?
Well, he sees the airplanes, right? And
Yeah.
they're new, they're exciting, and he sees the potential. There's this, I guess it's a famous story about his application. He supposedly wrote, "I have not gone to war in order to collect cheese and eggs, but for another purpose."
Well, that's a line. You can kind of hear his personality there a little bit, although who knows if he actually said that, right?
Yeah, some historians think it might be made up,
Hmm.
But it definitely, like, captures how he felt. He wanted more than just sitting around in the trenches.
For sure. So, okay, from bored cavalryman to aspiring pilot, what are his first steps like in the air service? What's he actually doing?
At first, he was an observer, on these reconnaissance missions, Eastern Front. Not glamorous, but he gets experience. Then he's transferred to Belgium, learns to fly there, might have even gotten an unconfirmed kill, who knows. But the real turning point was when he met Oswald Bollack.
Okay, now who's Bollack? Why is that such a big deal?
Well, Bollack was like top German ace, but not just a skilled pilot, he was a tactical genius, like really changed how air combat worked. Developed something called the Dicta Bollack. Basically, it was a set of principles, emphasized teamwork and strategy instead of just like, being a hotshot pilot trying to show off.
So it's almost like he's thinking of it more like a game of chess up in the air than just like dogfighting.
Exactly. It was about minimizing risk and getting the advantage.
What were some of the main ideas in this Dicta Bollack?
Well, some of the key things were, let's see, get above the enemy before you attack. Always keep your eye on your squadron leader. Never forget about your own lines. That kind of thing.
That does make sense. You'd think it'd be all about, crazy flying and just individual skill, but Bollack's like, no, we got to have a plan.
Exactly. And Richthofen, despite his later image as this, like, fearless ace, he really learned from those lessons.
Interesting. It makes you wonder if that's part of what made him so successful, right? He wasn't just relying on instinct. He was thinking it through. So when did he actually get his first confirmed victory?
It was September 17th, 1916. And get this. This might surprise you. He had silver cups made for every one of his victories.
Wait, silver cups? Like for every single one? What's the story there?
He started it himself, this tradition. Like some earlier pilots, they got cups for their first wins or something. But by Richthofen's time, it had stopped. But he kept having these cups made. All the way up to 60.
60 silver cups. Wow, that's dedication. Why'd he stop at 60 though?
Well, Germany was hurting for resources, the war. Silver was getting scarce. And he refused to accept cups made from like cheaper metals. He thought it would cheapen the whole tradition.
Wow. So even in the middle of a war, he's got this sense of like ceremony and high standards.
Definitely gives you a sense of his personality. And speaking of which, things get really interesting when we look at like how he becomes famous and that whole red plane thing.
Okay, yeah, the Red Baron. Like that's the name everyone knows, right? Why did he paint his plane red? What was the idea there?
It's a question that's caused a lot of debate. In his own autobiography, he said it was so the enemy could see him easily. But come on, why would you want to be a bigger target?
Right.
A lot of historians think it was more about psychology, like messing with the enemy's heads, and unit cohesion. Maybe even a little bit of branding, like you know how sports teams have colors to stand out, get the fans going.
Yeah.
Imagine seeing this bright red plane coming at you, intimidating.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And this whole thing, like becoming more distinct, it went beyond just him too. The other pilots in his Just 11, that's his squadron, they started painting parts of their planes red too. And that was kind of the beginning of, well, they called it the Flying Circus.
The Flying Circus. What a name. So it wasn't just a random bunch of pilots. It was like a real unit.
Exactly. They were super mobile, moved around a lot, using tents, caravans, the whole thing. It was like the total opposite of that static trench warfare.
Yeah, interesting. So we've got this picture now. Richthofen, a skilled tactician, leading this brightly colored mobile unit. But what kind of leader was he? Like, as a person, what was he like?
It's hard to say for sure. You know, the accounts from people who knew him, they're all over the place. Some said he was distant, unemotional, even, like, humorless. But others said he was actually pretty friendly, treated everyone the same. You know, officers, enlisted men, didn't matter to him. And he always said it was important for the pilots to have a good relationship with the mechanics.
Ah, yeah, the mechanics are the ones keeping the planes in the air, right?
Exactly, he got the bigger picture. But, you know, war takes a toll no matter how heroic it seems. And in July of 1917, Richthofen gets a serious head wound during a fight.
Oh, wow. That's scary. Did that ground him, like make him stop flying?
It's crazy, but he went back to active duty even though the doctors told him not to. But later, he did have to take some leave to recover. And they think that head wound, it might have caused some lasting damage, you know? Like nausea, headaches after flying, maybe even changed his personality some.
Makes you realize even the Red Baron, he wasn't invincible.
Right. And while he's recovering, he writes his autobiography. It's called Der Rote Kampfflieger. In English, that'd be the Red Battle Flyer.
I bet that book has some interesting stuff in it. Like, what kinds of things did he write about?
Well, you gotta remember, it was written under the, the watchful eye of the German propaganda machine, so you can't take everything as, the absolute truth. But there are moments where you can kind of hear his real voice coming through. For instance, he talks about how his dad made a distinction between a sportsman and a butcher.
Okay. What's the difference?
Well, the butcher, according to his dad, shoots just for fun, right? And then Richthofen, he says, I do not succeed in shooting down 2 Englishmen in succession. If one of them comes down, I have the feeling of complete satisfaction. Almost like he doesn't like the idea of just killing for sport.
Yeah, he's acknowledging that taking a life, even in war, it's not something to be taken lightly.
Exactly. And then there's this other part where he talks about how flying in combat, it's not this glorious adventure everyone back home thinks it is. He actually says, I am in wretched spirits after every aerial combat. I believe that the war is not, as the people at home imagine it, with a hurrah and a roar. It is very serious, very grim.
Yeah, it's like he's giving you a look at what it's really like, the psychological toll.
Yeah.
Not just the medals and the victories.
Exactly. And this all leads us to 1918, a year with a lot of highs and lows for Richthofen.
So he's back in action despite that head wound. Where does he go from here?
He's leading a larger unit now, even more mobile, and he's like a legend at this point. People are worried that if HE died, it would be like a huge blow to Germany.
So he's not just a pilot anymore, he's like a symbol.
Exactly, but, and this is important, by 1918, the war. It's not going Germany's way, they're losing control of the air.
Ah, okay, and so everything he's doing, it's even more impressive because it's happening when things are getting tougher. But as we know, the story, well, it doesn't have a happy ending. April 21st, 1918. That's the date that really made him a legend.
And it's the date of his last flight, a flight that's, there's still so much mystery around it, even now.
Okay, before we get into what exactly happened that day, I have to ask this. He was known for being cautious, right? A strategic thinker. Why was he flying so low and so far into enemy territory? It just seems so out of character.
It's a question that's, well, a lot of historians have tried to figure it out. So let's look at what we do know. Richthofen's leading a squadron. They're on patrol over the Somme River in France.
The Somme River.
Yeah.
That was like a major battleground, right, in World War I.
Oh, yeah. Huge EE. The Battle of the Somme, that was back in 1916, one of the bloodiest battles ever. It went on for months, and both sides just incredible casualties.
Wow. Okay, so we're already talking about a place with a lot of history. What happens next?
Well, Richthofen spots this plane, a British Sopwith Camel. It's being flown by a Canadian pilot, pretty new guy, named Wilfred Wapme.
A new pilot, huh?
Oh.
And Richthofen's going after him. Interesting.
Yeah, and there's more. See, May had just fired on Richthofen's cousin, Wolfram. He was part of the squadron that day.
Ah, okay. Family.
And Richthofen, he was known for being very loyal to his guys. So he sees his cousin under attack, and he breaks off to go after May.
So maybe a bit of, like, protective instinct.
Yeah.
And that puts him in a dangerous spot.
Could be. He chases May, low altitude, across the Somme, right into enemy territory.
And this is where another pilot comes in, right?
Correct.
Captain Arthur Roy Brown, also Canadian.
Yeah. Brown sees what's happening, sees Richthofen chasing May, and he dives down to try and stop him. Almost hits the ground, though. Has to pull up hard.
Okay, so we've got this whole chaotic scene, right?
Yeah.
2 British planes, one flown by a novice, one by a more experienced pilot. And then you've got the Red Baron, low altitude, maybe a little disoriented, deep in enemy territory. It sounds like something bad is about to happen.
And it does. At some point during this whole chase, a single bullet hits Richthofen. Fatal wound. His plane crashes in a field near this village called Vaux-sur-Somme.
I can only imagine what that did to morale on both sides.
Yeah.
He was such a big figure. But the story doesn't end there, does it? We still don't know who fired that shot.
Nope, still a mystery over 100 years later.
It's like a historical detective story. What are some of the theories people have?
Well, at first, they said it was Brown who got him, trying to protect May, but later people started to think maybe it was ground fire that got him.
Okay, what makes them think that?
They did an autopsy on Richthofen's body, and they saw that the bullet, it went in through his right armpit and came out near his left nipple. That angle, it doesn't really line up with Brown's attack. Brown was probably coming from behind and above.
So it had to be someone on the ground shooting up at him.
Yeah. And there were witnesses, even Wap May, the guy Richthofen was chasing, they said he kept chasing him for like a minute or two, even after Brown attacked. That wouldn't make sense if he'd already been hit by Brown's bullets.
So it pretty much rules Brown out. Is there any one person who they think might have fired the fatal shot?
There's this one guy, Sergeant Cedric Popkin, Australian anti-aircraft machine gunner. He was using a Vickers gun, and his position, it would have given him a clear shot at Richthofen from the side.
Which fits with how the bullet went through his body.
Right.
It's amazing to think that even with all this research, we might never know for sure who actually fired that shot. Adds to the whole mystery, I guess.
It does, but more than just WHO shot him, it's interesting to think about W.H.Y. Richthofen, a guy known for being careful. Why would he take such a big risk that day? What was going through his mind?
Yeah, the good question. What are some of the ideas people have come up with to explain that? Like, why would he do something so out of character?
Well, some people think that head wound he got earlier, it might have messed with his thinking, maybe his judgment wasn't as sharp.
Ah, it's possible.
Or maybe, and this happens to a lot of soldiers, maybe he was just exhausted. Combat fatigue, they call it. Like, you see so much death and destruction, it starts to wear you down mentally.
Right, we forget that even these guys, these legends, they were still human beings. All that stuff, it affects you.
Yeah. And then there's always a chance that, the weather was weird that day. Maybe the wind was unusual, blew him off course or something.
So many things could have been a factor. It makes you think, even in a story with all this heroism, these amazing feats, sometimes it just comes down to chance.
The human element. It's always there. So the Red Baron's dead. His plane's a wreck in a field in France. What happens next? How does everyone react?
I'm guessing the news spread quickly. He was so famous.
It was huge GE news on both sides. For the Allies, it was a major victory, obviously. Really hurt German morale. But even his enemies, they had to respect him. He was that good.
It's one of those weird things about war, You're fighting against each other, but you can still admire someone's skill and bravery, even if they're on the other side.
Yeah. And they gave him a full military funeral with honors, even though he was the enemy. Oh, yeah. The Australian Flying Corps, they were the closest to the crash site. They took care of his body. They buried him in a cemetery at a village called Bertingels. And the Allied squadrons, they even sent wreaths.
Wow. That says a lot. Even in death, they honored him.
But the story of his body, it doesn't end there. Later, they moved him to a bigger military cemetery at Fricourt.
And then eventually, in 1925, his family got his body back to Germany. His younger brother, Bolko, he really pushed for that. Must have been a huge thing for the family to have him back home.
It shows you the power of family, even after all that loss and chaos. But the journey of his remains, it doesn't end there.
There were more moves, more ceremonies.
Exactly. And it's kind of tied up in all the complicated stuff happening in Germany after World War I. We should talk about that when we come back for part 3.
So last we left off, the Red Baron's remains were back in Germany. What happened next?
Well, the family, they wanted to bury him in the Schweidnitz cemetery. That's where his dad was buried, and his brother Lothar, too. He died in a plane crash after the war in 1922. Pretty sad.
Yeah, to have both sons die in plane crashes.
It's a lot. Anyway, it seemed like the natural place to bury Manfred, with his family.
Yeah, it makes sense.
But the government, they had other ideas. They wanted him buried in the Invalidenfriedhof Cemetery in Berlin. That's where a lot of, famous German military heroes were buried, and past leaders, too. Ah, okay, so they wanted to use him as a symbol.
Exactly. Germany had just lost the war, morale was low. They thought using his image would help restore some national pride.
So they give him a state funeral, big public event.
Yeah, the whole 9 yards. And it doesn't end there, unfortunately. Fast forward a few years, the Nazi regime comes to power, and they see Richthofen as, well, perfect for their propaganda.
Oh, no.
Yeah, it's pretty disturbing. They hold this huge e-ceremony at his grave, put up a giant new tombstone, just one word on it, Richthofen.
It's crazy how easily heroes can be, manipulated like that, twisted to fit whatever agenda.
It's a dark side of history, for sure. And it's not over yet. Even after the Nazis are defeated, his story keeps getting tied up in all the turmoil in Germany.
Really? How so?
So during the Cold War, remember, Germany's divided, right?
Yeah.
Well, that Invalidenfriedhof Cemetery, it ends up right on the border between East and West Berlin. Talk about a tense location.
Oh, wow.
His tombstone, it even got hit by stray bullets. People were trying to escape from East Germany. There were shootings. It was a mess.
Yeah.
So he's literally caught in the middle of all this historical drama.
Pretty much. It's like his story becomes part of the story of Germany itself.
That's powerful. So did he ever, find peace? Was he ever buried somewhere quiet, out of the spotlight?
Finally, in 1975, yeah. They moved his remains to Wiesbaden. There's a Richthofen family plot in the Südfriedhof Cemetery there.
Okay, that's better. At least he's not right in the middle of all that Cold War tension anymore.
Right. But even though his body's finally resting in peace, people still argue about him. His life, his death, everything.
I guess that's what happens when you become a legend, right? People never stop talking about you.
Exactly. And one of the biggest debates is about how many victories he actually had. Some people think he didn't really shoot down 80 planes. They think maybe it was exaggerated, propaganda.
So was the Red Baron all hype? Or was he really that good?
Well, historians, they've done a lot of research. They've checked his claims against Allied records, looked at squadron info, plane serial numbers, even the names of the pilots he fought against. And it pretty much all adds up.
So those 80 confirmed victories, they're legit.
Looks like it. And there might even be a few more unconfirmed ones. Either way, he did it all while fighting an enemy that usually had more planes, better planes.
It's impressive no matter how you look at it.
No doubt. And besides just the numbers, you got to think about the man himself, He was a complicated guy, kind of a symbol of both, the glory of war and the tragedy of it. He was a product of his time, for sure, shaped by his upbringing, his culture, the war itself.
Yeah, he had regrets about killing, even though he was a skills warrior. He's a hero, but then his image got used for propaganda. It's hard to wrap your head around it all.
And that's why he's so fascinating, I think. He makes you think about war, about what it means to be a hero, even makes you question, good and evil. It's not always black and white.
He's a reminder that history, it's not just about dates and battles. It's about people, real people whose lives are changed by everything around them.
He also makes us think about how we tell stories about heroes. We got to look beyond the myths, the propaganda, and try to see the real person underneath it all.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? Well, you've gotten a glimpse into the world of Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron. But this is just the beginning.
There's so much more to learn. Read about World War I, learn about the other pilots, the Allies, the Germans, the ones who fought and died up there in the sky. Try to see things from both sides.
And as you learn more, think about this. Does Richthofen's story make war seem glorious? Or does it remind us how terrible it really is? What can we learn from him, the good and the bad?
And hey, if you're curious about how the Red Baron's shown up in pop culture, music, movies, all that, check out that Snoop Dogg song. The Wikipedia article mentions it. It's a trip. Just goes to show his name, his image, it's still out there.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep.